So we're going to be setting up a server today. This has nothing to do with Stripe quite yet, but we want to have a GraphQL server that we can then add on to and add Stripe to. So in this video, we're going to be setting up Apollo Server 2 and then add authentication to it. So we're going to be able to register users and then log in with users. So to do this, we're going to need to store these users somewhere, so a database. And here I'm going to be using Typeform and PostgreSQL, but feel free to switch either of those out. What we use to store the users isn't very important. Anything will really work. So the steps are, we're going to first install Typeform, and we're just going to go through the quick start here. So if you haven't, you want to go ahead and install Typeform globally by running that command. And then I'm just going to run this Typeform init. So here I'm just going to change the database to Postgres, and then the name of the project I'm just going to call server. And so what that does is just adds a little bit of a boilerplate to set up a Typeform project. And I'm going to just open that up in Visual Studio Code, and let's go ahead and full screen this. And we're done with terminal over here, so you can close that if you want to. And let's put this over here. Now, my package.json, they actually give you some old dependencies right here, so we can actually upgrade those real quick. I'm going to first just do yarn to install the dependencies because it doesn't do that for us. And then we can say yarn upgrade interactive latest, and what this will do is allow us to pick which ones we want to upgrade. So we have now this little prompt here, and I'm going to hit the spacebar, and that will put a little green circle on the ones that I want to, and I can just use the arrow keys and then hit enter. And the ones that I selected will now all be upgraded. So now we're using the latest TypeScript and TS node, which is important. All right, the next thing they give us is a tsconfig. This I don't really care for either. So I'm going to use the one that I used for one of my last projects. I'll link this below if you want to copy it. Let's go ahead and remove this. But again, you can do this to your liking as well. I'm going to remove the base URL and paths. We don't need those, I don't think. We was using those for yarn workspaces, which we're not going to use here. So good with tsconfig. The next thing we need to talk about is the orm-config. So this talks about how you actually connect to the database. So I'm using Postgres, and here it specifies the database. So I'm going to call my database Stripe example, and then the username and password, I'm going to be using Postgres because that's what I have set up. If you don't have a database set up already and don't have Postgres installed, you're going to want to install Postgres, get it up and running, and then create a user name and password on the account. So for me, I have Postgres, and that's what I'm going to use here, and then create a database. So to be able to create that database, I have the Postgres tools installed, so I can use them through the CLI. So I can just say create database and then run Stripe example, and that'll create a Stripe example database. So we actually have to create the database ourselves, and then Typeform will connect to that. All right, and the default for everything else is good. We can keep that. All right, if we look inside of source, we can see what tsconfig or what Typeform gave us to start off with. There's this index file which runs some code, and what this does is it's inserting a user into the database and then finding a user in the database. And we can run this just to make sure everything connects okay. We can also take a look at the entity over here. This is how you create tables in the database with Typeform. So here we have a single user. All right, so let's go ahead and run this and make sure I can connect okay. So I'm just going to say yarn start, and that should just insert a user, and we can see it inserting the user, and it was able to find a user. So if that worked for you, this is what it should look like. Otherwise, see to the errors. All right, so we have that. The next thing I want to set up is Apollo Server. So let's go ahead and go through the docs for setting that up. Now I'm going to be using not the default Apollo server. I want to use the one with Apollo Server Express because I want to be using Express because that'll allow me to set up my own sessions, which we're going to be using for authentication. So we're going to be using under the middleware section, we're going to be following that getting started. And I'm just going to copy this and paste it in. So let's go ahead and paste it into our index over here. And I'm just going to paste it below, and then I'm going to move this up to the top. And then we're going to get these to play nice with each other in a second. And then we're using TypeScript, so we can go ahead and change these to import statements. And we're going to worry about the type defs and the resolvers in a second, so I'm just going to remove that. And we'll move GQL for now. And we're going to say import from Apollo Server Express. Now we haven't actually added this package yet, so let's go ahead and do that. And we're going to go ahead and install all the other packages we're going to need. So for this, we're going to be using the following packages. So Apollo Server Express, which is going to be our server. We need to install GraphQL because we're using GraphQL. And then Express is what we're going to use for our server and pair with Apollo. And then also we're going to be using sessions with Express Session. And then we're going to be adding bcrypt. And bcrypt is for hashing passwords. That way we don't store just the user's password as plain text. And of course we're using Typescript, so we're going to need to install some types. So we're going to install types express, bcrypt, express session, and then GraphQL as well. Alright, and then that should get rid of some of the errors that we have here. And I want to just start up the server and make sure that Apollo server is working correctly. So what I'm going to do is for now just comment out this block of code that creates the connection. So I'm going to comment out the entities and what we have up here. So we can just focus on Apollo server for now. So to be able to get Apollo server to compile, we need to start adding some type defs and resolvers, and then set up our app, which is going to be an Express app, and then we can start it up. So I'm going to create in the source here a file called typedefs, and that's going to be a TypeScript file. And here I'm going to import GQL from Apollo Server Express. Not sure why I didn't autocomplete. And here I'm going to say export const typedefs. So now with Apollo Server 2, you actually use this GQL tag from Apollo Server when you're creating your schema here. So this is going to be our schema or typedefs. And here I'm going to say type query. And I'm just going to set up a dummy query so we can make sure it's working. So I'm going to return a string from that. So I have a single query hello that returns a string. Let's go ahead and create the resolver for it. So I'm going to call it resolvers, export const resolvers, and this is going to be an object which has a query which has a hello in it, and that's just going to return hi. Alright, so now in our index over here we can import both of these. So import typedefs, yes, import that, and I just hit command and then the dot, or probably control and then period. And what I mean by dot is period. So command period or control period will bring up that menu that I just did, and that'll just auto import typedefs and resolvers up here for us. Next up, let's create this app. So I'm going to say const app is equal to express, and then we just need to import express up here. So import star as express from express. Alright, so that got rid of the errors, and I think we can run this and see if it works. And if it does, we should have the server started on port 4000, and we should be able to query this to be able to get hello from it. So I'm just going to say yarn start, and then we'll see if it comes up in the message here. It should say starting on port 4000. Good. I'm going to go ahead and click on that, and when you come here you should see something like this. So this is GraphQL Playground, and here we can make requests. So the request that I want to make, I'm going to say hello, and I don't need to do anything else. It should just return stuff. Alright, so we see our message hi. If you got this far, that means you successfully set up Apollo Server and Express. And so that is the meat of what I wanted to do of setting this up. At least the meat of the setup is done. Now we're going to be adding some things to our server. So I want to be able to add a user or register a user. And then I want to be able to log in with that user. So let's go ahead and first create the register function for this. So to start off with, I'm going to start with the entity, this user entity in here. So this is what the user looks like right now. I'm going to keep this simple and just have an email and a password field, and get rid of this age and all the other ones we had. And I'm just going to make this a type text. So both of them are text in the PostgreSQL type. And then I'm going to have it extends base entity. Base entity allows us to just do some things that make our life easier with typeform. So now I can just say like user.find to find things, or user.create to create things. And I can use this user object or user class directly if I extend base entity. So that's why I'm doing that there. So now I want to be able to register a user and put in this information. So I'm going to start by adding a mutation for that. So I'm going to say type mutation, and we'll call it register. And we're going to take two things, an email, which is a string, and that's required, and a password. Password, which is a string as well. And it's just going to return a Boolean. I'm going to return true or false, whether the register worked. So now in our resolver over here, I'm going to say mutation, and we're going to say register. And now in the register here, we don't care about the first argument. That's going to be the parent. And then what we care about here is the two things that we passed in there. So here we have an email and a password as our arguments. So I'm going to say email password. And it doesn't like it because we haven't set up what the heck the type definition is for this. And I think we can use something called maybe like iResolvers or something from GraphQL tools. I don't know if that's going to be the right type. Looks like it does work pretty well. Elements are unused. Yep. So this is what we'll use. And if I click on this, I can see what it looks like. So I think this creates just the type for our resolver. And I don't want to go through that. I'm just going to assume it is correct. And we aren't creating resolvers here, so it probably is right. And then we can see if it doesn't work, we can fix it later. So our email and password. So here I can add a user by saying user.create, and I can pass in my email and password. But this is not, first off, this actually doesn't create the user in the database quite yet. We have to call save on it. That's how Typeworm works. And secondly, we're saving the password as plain text, which is a bad idea. And I'm going to make this function asynchronous. So the only thing I want to add before this is, instead of creating a user with a password that's just exactly what the password is, we're going to hash it. So I'm going to say hashed password. And then here we're going to say bcrypt, or we're going to import bcrypt from bcrypt. And let's import it like this. So here we're going to await, because bcrypt.hash is an asynchronous function, passing in our password, and we have to give this salt, let's say 1, so it runs fast. Let's just do 10. 10's a good number for hashing. I think you want 10 or 12 or higher than that when hashing. I was going to just do 1 so it runs faster, but let's go ahead and make it at least 10. So this is our hash password. This is what we want to store in the database. So I'm going to say password is equal to hashed password. So now if I run this, what it's going to do is it's going to create a user in the database whenever we call this register mutation. And of course we need to return true that it worked. The other thing is, in our index file over here, we need to actually create a connection to our database before we can do any of that. So here I'm going to just create a little function which I'm going to call start server. So I'm going to say start server. And I'm going to do all this stuff in here, pass it in there, and I'm going to make this asynchronous, and we're just going to call start server here. So I didn't do anything different with that step there. All I did was I wrapped it in the function. I made it asynchronous, which we'll see why in a second, and then I'm calling the function here. Reason why I did that is I'm now just going to add the create connection that we had up there and use it here. So I'm going to say const. And we don't really actually care about the connection. We can just say await create connection. And we are using it right here. Why doesn't it like it here? Did I import it from the wrong place? Yeah, I did. So we want create connection from Typeworm. There we go. So I made this asynchronous so I could just await it here to create the connection. So this will create the database connection for us. And then we're good to be able to use the user and create it in the database in our resolver now. And I can remove all this stuff here. So what they were doing there, and we can take a look at it again, is they created a connection, and then you'll notice they created a user entity and did stuff with that user entity here. So we can create the connection here and then use it later, which we're doing. So go ahead and delete that. And we don't need our user entity here. I don't know if you guys saw that. I think it auto imported when I did that, but we got our user from the entity user over here. Alright, so now if I start this up, I can call a register function. So we'll do yarn start, and let's go ahead and try this out. So if I reload here, it's going to have a new thing that we can call, which is called register, and it didn't, oh okay, we crashed, so let's see what we did wrong. column email contains null values. I'm not sure why it contains null value. Oh, I'll tell you why, because we synchronized. So in this case, I'm surprised that it didn't actually just straight delete the users. So what happened is we had a user in our database that we added before, and then I changed the schema here. So in our orm config, we have synchronize equal to true. There might be just another type orm setting that would allow us to drop the database each time. I'm just going to go ahead and drop the database myself. So I can say drop db stripe example, and I'm going to recreate it. So now we can yarn start again, and now it's able to start okay, because our user is now, we didn't have any users before, now it's blank. So let's see, now if I say register, cool. So email, I'm going to say bob@bob.com, password bob, and let's go ahead and create it, and it says true. So we created the user now in our database. If we wanted, we could verify this. So I could say pSQL, and then I could say stripe example, and now I'm connected to the database, and I can select all from users. Or what is it called, user? No, let's go ahead and see. So I don't know what the table name is, so if we do \d, that'll tell us the tables, and it looks like it called it user, and it's doing something weird, and I think it's because it's trying to name it users. I'm just going to name the database called users. So I don't see the table here, and I don't think it's user, and when I select all from user, it thinks I'm talking about a different user. So just to avoid that entire problem, I'm going to rename the database called users, and I can, or sorry, not the database, but just this table. So I'm renaming the user table to users. Let's go ahead and do yarn start again, and I'm going to add Bob again. Was able to add okay. And now if I do the exact same thing I was going to do before, I can do \d. I can now see there's a users table, so I'm going to select all from users. And we can see our Bob user. So Bob was successfully added now to that table, and I'm not going to worry about that user table because it's not easy to select. I think we have to just prefix it with something. Alright, so now we have register user. Let's go ahead and do login. Alright, well we can add it inside of the mutation here. I'm going to call it login. We can keep this email password, it's going to be the same. But instead of just a boolean, I'm going to return a user. So let's go ahead and create a user type here. I'll create it above, I guess. Let's add some space. And this user is just going to have an email and an ID. And with ID, there's a special type that we can use called ID, like that Apollo uses, so we can use that for IDs. And alright, so that looks good. So we're going to return a user upon logging in. Let's go ahead and add the logic for that. Alright, so let's add it to our resolvers here. Go ahead and say login, make it asynchronous. We're going to get an email and a password. And so we want to just verify that the email and password is correct. So I'm first going to find a user. So I'm going to say await user.find. And we're going to find, I think actually I need to say where. Yeah, there we go. Where email. So in this case, we're going to find a user where the email matches. And if we can't find a user, we're just going to return null. So let's make sure, yeah, sometimes we're not going to return a user, so I'm going to make this nullable here. So let's go back to our resolver. In this case, we couldn't find a user, so we're going to return null. Next thing, we want to make sure that we got the right password. So I'm going to say const valid, and we're going to say await bcrypt.compare. And here we're going to pass in the string, which is what we pass in here. That's our string password, and compare it against our hashed password, which in this case is going to be user.password. And why does it not let me? Oh, okay, this is an array. So I said find here. I only want a single user, so I'm going to say find one. And so now it's a single user that I get back, not multiple users. All right, so if it's not valid, we're going to return null. Otherwise, we found our user, so we're just going to return the user here. Alright, so let's try the login. Go ahead and say yarn start. Come back over here, and now instead of register, we're going to say login. And so let's go ahead and do that. And here I'm going to grab the ID and the email. So request it. Now we can see Bob. We get an ID and an email. So the next step, now that we're able to register and log in a user, is to actually keep that user logged in. And we're going to be using Express Session for that. And for this, what I'm going to do is we're going to create a session for when that user logs in here. And then we're going to be able to request that user later, just based off of the session. So let's go ahead and add Express Session to our packages here, or to our Express. So it's going to be a middleware that we add. So I'm going to say import star as session from Express Session. And so I'm going to say app.use, and here we can pass in session, and we can push, or we can add any kind of config we want. In this case, I'm going to say save uninitialized to false and resave to false. Everything else, I'm going to keep the default. I think the default should be fine. Let's see what it doesn't like. Property secret, so it looks like I have to pass in a secret. So I'm just going to do a random string for my secret. So resave, why I turned both of these off to false is what resave does is it'll constantly resave the session even if it didn't change. So I like to turn that off and just wait till it changes. And then save uninitialized, I want to wait and assign a user a session until we've actually added some data on them. So that's what those do. Oh, I don't want to add a semicolon there. There we go. So now inside of my resolver, I want to be able to add a cookie for that user. So I can do that by accessing, now that we added the session here, on the request object there is a session. So we can get access to that in our context. So context here, we're going to add to our resolvers. And one of the contexts that we get is request, which they just call rec. And we can pass that in like that. And let's see, it doesn't as any, so yeah, let's go ahead and just say as. Actually, no, I think I just need to say any like that. Okay. So I'm going to call it any. They didn't add type definitions for it because I'm not sure why Apollo didn't add a type definition for the context here. Maybe it's expecting me to add something. No, it's not. I believe it's rec. I want to double check and make sure that's right. So in my resolver over here, let's go ahead and add it to the login resolver because that's the one I care about. So this third one now has a request I can access. And I'm just going to console.log and see if that exists or if that's null. So let's go ahead and log in now. And you can see we have all this stuff now. And at the bottom here, this is the thing we care about. Here's our session. So this is where we can set a cookie. And let's go ahead and do that. So request was what we wanted. So now we can access that. And here at the bottom, I'm going to say request.session.userid is equal to user.id. So how I'm going to know that the user is who they are is we're going to store a cookie on them. And in our server, we're going to store the user ID on our server. So I'm going to keep this user ID in this session. And this is how you set it. So when I set the user ID right here, request session or express session knows to add a cookie to the user. So now a cookie is going to get sent whenever we do login. We can see this cookie by inspecting. Alright, so if I come to my application, we'll close this. So I'll come over here, I can go to cookies, localhost, and I can see right now there's no cookies on this guy. And if I were to request this, and I don't want any tracing. If I were to request this right now, so did I start up the server? No, I didn't start that up. And we'd run this right now. We're not going to get a cookie back. It has no cookie here. And the reason for that is we need to be able to include the credentials. So this is a setting we have to add right here. So if you click on that little cog there, it adds the settings for Playground, and one of the settings is to omit the credentials. So it's omitting the cookie right now. So we want to change that to include. We're going to say save here, And now when we log in, it's going to actually store a cookie for this user. And you saw when I clicked log in there, we can see here's our cookie for that user. And now we have a cookie on them, we can know who they are and be able to request the user later. So what I mean by that is, let's go ahead and add a new typedef, new mutation. Well, actually it's going to be a new query. So instead of hello, we're going to call this me. And so what me is going to do is return a user possibly. So in our resolver here, I'm going to say me. We don't care about the parent. We don't care about the arguments. And why I didn't really explain this before, but if I don't care about an argument, I do this underscore to say we don't want to use it. And I used 2 here because we used 1 there. So here's in our request. So I can say user ID. Well, I don't even have to say that. I can say request.session.userID. So this is going to be stored. So I can just console log this. And then I'm going to return null, just so we can see what this is. And I'm now going to call that. So I'm going to say query me. And we don't need to have query there. Let's go ahead and refresh. I'm going to grab the ID in the email. So it's going to return null now, so we told it to. But notice it's undefined right now, which is kind of interesting because I would have actually expected we should have got a session back because I have a cookie right here. Let's see what we did wrong or if we should expect it to be. So I'm just going to console log it like that, and we should be able to see what the entire session is. So I set the user ID in the session here, and so up here I would expect to be able to access that same session because it's going to be stored in the cookie and whatnot. Oh, you know what? I'll tell you what we did wrong. We're storing it in memory. That's the other thing. So over here, when I started the session, or when we add the session to the middleware here, we can have it store the data in different places. Right now we're just storing it in memory, but we can have it stored to Redis or our database or whatever. But if it's in memory, what that means is as soon as I turn off my server, it's going to forget all the past sessions. So that's what happened there, I think. So now if I log in and without turning off my server come over here and request me, we should be able to see what it said 1. I'm not sure what that. Okay, let's clear the session, log in, and then request it. And let's see if it's, why is it just saying 1? I'm going to say session. The session should be an object, not just a 1. Let's go ahead, clear this, start up our server. Oh, you know what? Oh! Okay, that it was working. I just didn't realize it was working. So if we request this, yeah, now it works good. So our user ID was actually 1. So when I saw 1 getting printed out there, I had no idea what it was, but that was just our user ID. So this was what I was trying to show you guys. So when we request the session, it now stores that user ID that we used when the user logged in, so we know who they are. So now we can use this user ID. So now I can say const user, and I can just straight return it here. So we're going to return user.find1, and we're going to find it, and we can just specify the ID here, request.session.userid. And we can also say if not. So if they don't have a session or a user ID for whatever reason, we're just going to return null. So if a session is not current, if we don't have a cookie stored for that user, it's going to be null. So we can just return null. Otherwise, if we have a user ID, we're going to fetch them from the database. All right, so let's come over here. We have a login. So I'm going to log in as Bob. And let's clear this. And let's go ahead and make sure I restart the server because that'll be a problem if I don't. Alright, so I'm logging in as Bob, and now I'm going to come over here and I'm going to request me, and now we have Bob over here. So now just to make sure you guys get what's happening, let's go ahead and register one other user. So this is going to be Bob2. Let's call it Tom. All right, so now we have a Tom, and now I'm going to log in as Tom. And let's grab the ID and the email. Okay, so now when I log in as Tom, we have a session here, or a cookie stored for Tom. And now when I come over here, it knows that I'm Tom. If I log in as Bob, I get a new cookie, and that cookie corresponds to Bob. So now when I come over here and call me, it now knows that I'm Bob. So depending on who I log in as, we get a different cookie, and that cookie is storing different data. And we just look at that cookie to see who the user is, and that's what we return from this me function. And so on our front end, which we're going to be building tomorrow, we're going to log in as a user. The user is going to we're going to have a cookie stored on their browser. And so when they make requests, we know who they are based off of that cookie. And then we can get that user by calling the me query if we want to. So that is it. That is how we set up our server with authentication, being able to register, log in, and then keep who that user is. And this cookie will persist, by the way, at least I believe it will. So like if I refresh the page and request this me, it still knows that I'm Bob, even though I came back at a different time. All right, so that's it for this video, guys. I'll see you tomorrow.